Good afternoon, evening and morning, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a new set of guitar amp VSTs that I've been turned on to, and that is Thermionik by Kazrog. And these things sound absolutely great, as you can hear. So let's get into looking at that today. Okay, so here is my Reaper project. As you can see, if you look on the left here, there is nothing on the master bus. There's quite a bit going on with the drums and bass, but we'll just ignore those for today. They're just for demo purposes. This whole project is just something that I came up with as a bit of a noodle, so this is a great example to use for showing you what's going on rather than actually talking about the tracks. So the drums and bass, just to show you quickly, is a superior drummer with the bass being a copy of one of the guitars, just pitched down an octave and run through amplitude, which sounds pretty bad. Sounds terrible really, but I've thrown that together so quickly because it's not really part of this demo. This demo is more about this. Now let's break this down a little bit. So I'm going to turn off any mixing that I've got, turn off the small room impulse response that I'm using, and just hit. I'm going to mute one of these amps because I'm running 2 amps as well, so we'll come back to that at the end of this. So here's one. Sounds like old school thrash, and that's because that's Thermionik with the M2CP, which is a Mesa Mark IIC+, which, if you know your guitar amps, is the original kind of Metallica Master of Puppets. All the gain, all the thrash amp. It's pretty much the amp that is used on a lot of metal stuff throughout the 80s. So before we look at that, let's work backwards from the cabinet. So I've used Kazrog's Recabinet as the cabinet IR loader, and the reason I've used this is partly just to evaluate it with the other Kazrog stuff, but it's got inbuilt high pass and low pass, which is useful. So I've taken anything below 66 Hz out and low passed using my ears to just above 12K in this case. It's got low mid and high mid EQ, which I've decided not to use for the purposes of this demo. And I'm using Rosen Digital's American Custom on all the amps, all the cabs, because it's a really good overall impulse response. It's got a Celestion V30 and an Eminence Red coat blended together, and it gives you kind of a thick, warm, yet bitey kind of blend, which is great for showing you what the amp can do rather than what the speakers can do. If you prefer the sound of a particular cabinet, a particular mic, cool, go for it. I'm just trying to give you an idea more of the amps than the cabinets. One thing that's hidden in here actually is there is a dynamics switch, which a lot of loaders don't have this. I've seen this in TSE's X50 as the movement knob, and this just adds a little bit of kind of space to the impulse responses. So that is on each amp that we're using, so that's just going to stay on permanently. And if you hear this now, this is, like I just played, this is with that and with the Mark II C+. Now, each one of these has a 14-day trial, as you can see here. It's I'm trying all these in trial mode. There are a lot of these. Let's just flick onto the Thermionik website. It's kazrog.com. I just want to have a look just to show you how many amps there are, because the way that he set this up, each amp is its own separate VST, which means that it's very memory light. You only load what you need, which is very useful because there are different selections, different switches, different algorithms obviously per amp, and unlike something like Amplitude where it's one shell that loads everything, which has quite a significant memory overhead. I think it's something like 250, 300 megabytes for Amplitude. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you've got something like 12 guitar amps in a song, say some clean amps, some crunchy, some distorted, whatever, that becomes on the order of gigabytes, where the amount of RAM that it's using, let's just see if we can find that out. The amount of RAM use is 2 gigabytes for this entire project, all of these, including every amp that's bypassed there, which is pretty useful. Just check my CPU temperatures because I've recently cleaned out the laptop. So there's all sorts of stuff. If you're into clean stuff, there's Fender Bassman Deluxe Reverb, and there's classic Marshall Plexis, including 2 different ones with the Moss. And the ones that I've been interested in, and the ones that I'll be talking about today, are the dual Rectifier 2-channel, which is the original 90s one, which is quite chunky and chewy. We'll be looking at the Marshall JCM 800 and how it compares to the Friedman BE100, the Friedman Brown Eye, which is the one that I was told about, which got me interested in this, because it's the first Friedman Brown Eye model that I've heard that does a decent job of doing what it's supposed to. And then I looked down the list and I went, oh, because there's a Mesa Mark IIC Plus and a Mark IV, which is one of my favourite amps. There's also Peavey 5150 Mark I, Mark II and Mark III, all separately. I've not tried the Framer's Cobra yet, so I might come back to that. What else have we got? So there's the Bogner Uber shell. And that's about all we're going to talk about today, but there's a good list, so get a good look at this list if you get a chance. Because these all, as far as I can tell, seem to be pretty accurately modelled. So let's switch from that Mark II to this rectifier. This is, I've put this on the orange modern channel. If you know anything about the old rectifiers, it was orange channel and the red channel. And the orange channel had a lot more kind of squish to it and a lot more life, in my opinion. And the red channel was kind of new metal in a box. So this is with the same cab as before. Oh, must mention quickly, in front of all these I've currently got the TSE Audio 808 Tubescreamer, so I'm going to turn that off for a while just so I can show you how this sounds. No Tubescreamer, so as if it were just the amp. Now that is big and bouncy and very dual rec-ish. It's got a lot of low end, even with the mids up at 6 or 7, there's not a lot of mid going on. It's a very scooped amp. Let's have a look. The options are just to turn on different settings, pretty much. This has the bold and spongy setting and the silicon and tube rectifier choices, which is not something I've seen in any other model of note. I'm sure there are some, just let me know here what they are. So if I hit play with the spongy mode with the tube rectifiers, all low end should stop being tight and suddenly be quite thick. So you don't get that thump out of the low end, but you do get a very definite chunkiness that could work for you if you're doing something like doom metal or something like that. So the gain, I've only got about 12 o'clock. Dialed the bass back a little and pushed the treble and presence as I always do. There's a depth which is turned off by default, but I've turned on the depth because that's the equivalent of a resonance knob, and I like to get the cabinets moving quite a lot. using the resonance, and then shelve a little low end out afterwards, because then I get that real thump thump kind of thing in the low end. So if you've got a really tight rhythm player, you can feel it. It gives it more of a 3D kind of feel. There's this normal and bright switch, which seems to take a lot of the low end out. I do wonder if that's just a low cut for the input to give the amp a lot more definition, which is what I was using that 808 for in the first place, so this could be in place of that. But the Tubescreamer 808 just gives a certain kind of mid-bite, which I like, so I went with that route. Now, let's just quickly compare this with the Poulan Lecto, which I know a lot of guys use. My mate Chris uses this all the time and raves about it, but this is, with the settings, pretty much identical. So yeah, high presence, resonance up a bit. Right, let's see how this sounds in comparison. And then it's only now that I'm hearing the Lecto compared to something newer like this dual rec from Thermionik that I realise just how far off it is from sounding like a rectifier, because I know what a real Rectal sounds like, and I can tell you it sounds a lot closer to the Thermionik model. I mean, there is a subtle something that the real one's got, but we're getting so close now. That sounds pretty real to me. Now, if this is too bassy for you, what I wouldn't usually do is turn the bass down on the amp. Not too far anyway, it starts to sound quite kind of weak. What I would do is I would EQ it later and take out some bass post amp. So aside from that, I mean, there is more low end in this cab as well, but as you saw in Recabinet, I've shelved below 66 Hz because that's just going to get in the way of the mix. That's going to get in the way of the kick drum, and that's going to get in the way of the bass when I actually track a real bass. So that is why it's just there as a safeguard, really. Let's talk quickly about this saturation knob, because this is one of the most important things. When I loaded this up, it was at 5, so it's I think this is replicating the sound of the power tubes at different volume levels, and I really like to push tube amps depending on the sound I'm going for. Most of the time I find that if I don't want it to sound sterile, I want to really give them a kick. In real life, I'd probably run a rectifier around volume 5 or 6. I wouldn't run it all the way at 10 because it just gets ridiculous. Not just because of volume, because I've got a soundproof live room, but because the definition just goes to hell. But this saturation knob, it does make it louder, so I'll have to bring the output volume up to match to show you the difference. But if I turn the saturation knob down, this is how it sounds. Not bad. And then the saturation up, but the volume down to match. Now, depending on your style of mixing, you may think that the saturation, because it's compressing everything a little, isn't to your taste, but I find that that fits in a mix better because it's not crunching and popping and pushing everywhere. It's kind of cohesively gelled, and especially when I run that through a virtual tape machine and an analog channel strip and get maybe a little bit of EQ magic dust on there, and the saturation really helps it just sit either side of the drums and just give you that big powerful thing. Now, the dual rec on its own, the mids really do sit back, like I said, but that's to be expected. So if the Mark II, which we'll bring that up now, which is on the other channel, I've really turned the bass down on this and cranked the mids, but there's a reason, and the reason is this one's got a tab. It's EQ. Now the channel I've picked, because this is a metal demo, I've picked the lead channel every time. And the lead channel on this, you see how I've done this V with the EQ? That's how you would do a classic Mesa 5-band EQ on the guitar amp. You might kind of have more or less mids, maybe a little more 2K if you're doing something like a solo or you really want to stand out. But this is how you really get that kind of crunchy, metallic-y kind of tone. So this is set, the gain isn't on 1,000,000, but if I turn that EQ off, you'll see how much this amp sucks without it. Now that is a classic thrash amp. Now if I switch out the Mark II for the Mark IV, we should find, yeah, so the controls mimic the Mark IV, which has a couple of extra switches, the normal and bright and everything. So I've done the same with, I've rolled the bass right off and I've boosted it in the EQ section here again. The saturation's quite high up. There is a fat switch which seems to, if I was using this amp on its own, makes it a little more metalish. There's the presence shift, which if you pull out the presence knob on a Mark IV, that brings the presence to a higher kind of EQ band and really makes that kind of 7K range poke out. I personally like it a little lower down because I like a rich mid, but if you want to really poke out the mix, that's a very Lamb of God kind of thing, is that those guys use Mark IVs with the presence shift to really give it that brutal top end without being nasty on the ultra top. There's also this mid gain switch. I'm not quite sure what that does on a Mark IV, but it just seems to be like a gent switch. It just gives it a little bit more aggressive mids, which is great. So let's go over to, what is this? Psycho Ace. This is a 5150 Mark 1. So this not quite my kind of thing. It sounds like it's really tearing up those preamp tubes. And I've got a 6505, and it does sound a lot like that. It might work better in a mix, but on its own that's not quite for me. It's a bit loose sounding. So let's go over from the American stuff to the British stuff and look at the Marshall JCM 800. So this, it looks like, I've turned saturation to full because that's how you'd ideally run a British amp, is absolutely full whack. And the amp sounds quite decent. If you're listening very closely to this, you can hear it because I've not used the gate. With the gain so high, you can actually hear the strings ringing on my guitar at either end, behind the bridge and above the nut, which is why I usually dampen them off. And that's why guys from bands like Asking Alexandria, those kind of guys, and Bring Me the Horizon, using JCM 800s, they block off the either side of the strings to stop that happening because you can hear it. Now that's the JCM 800 sound. It's not far off. I mean, unless you mod a JCM 800, that's pretty much the stock sound you're going to get. Now, if I replace that with the Friedman Brown Eye, which looks like a Marshall but is nothing like, the channel I've used on this is actually the middle one, the Brown Eye channel, and not the hairy Brown Eye channel, because that, to me, doesn't sound right. But I saw Steve Vai's second guitarist, Dave Weiner, using one of these on stage last week, and he had the gain on the Brown Eye channel absolutely cranked to 10. And his settings were kind of like this, and it sounds like so. So that doesn't really need a gain boost or a low cut in front of it or anything. That sounds pretty much ready to go to me. In the way that I've set up this mix, it doesn't mix well with what I'm planning to do, but that doesn't mean it's a bad amp at all. It's a fantastic setup. The Brown Eye, I mean, in real life I'd quite like one. So what I decided to do is something that I've really liked with guitarists that I've listened to is either using a dual rectifier as a secondary amp, or just using two amps with the same setup. Usually one for the beefiness and one for the mids, so that they can both breathe in their own kind of tubey way, and it just gives you a very full, thick sound without you having to quad track, which can cause issues if your guitarist isn't that tight. And in this case, I'll admit that the guitars are not very tight, but that's because I was throwing them together in a bedroom just with no intention of ever releasing this, so this is just used as a demo. But it's a great example of what happens. I'm going to turn this Tubescreamer back on, because that's how I would use a metal amp in this situation. So if I use the rectifier on one channel here and the Mark IV here, run them both together through identical cabinets, then this is what we get. How about that? No mixing, no nothing. There are still a few things I would do to make that sit in a mix. Let's change the Mark II out of the Mark IV. So the Mark IV's got more of an upper mid bite, so I'm going to stick with the Mark II, because I think that fits together with the dual rectifier better. But those two are sent to this guitar mix channel. So if I turn on Slate's virtual tape machine and the virtual mix rack, which has a tube input strip which isn't doing much, it just adds a little something. There's a compressor that isn't actually compressing, it's taking maybe half a dB off some of the low chugs, but more than anything it's given a transformer saturation which just makes it sound that much richer. And then there's a virtual mix bus going through an SSL 4000E series, and that again is just adding a certain something which it could do perfectly well without, but it just helps things settle into a mix better. So without those two chains, that's like this. And with, it's like this. You might not hear much of a difference there, but once that's fit into a mix, you'll be surprised. Now, the extra thing that I'm going to do, what I almost always do on heavy guitars, is I'm going to throw a small room reverb, like an impulse response, it's less than a second, on, and that sounds like this. As you can hear, the snares come into this as well, just to sit it a bit better, but that goes under the guitars like so. And that just fills them out again in the mix. So above the guitar and bass. Now, I'm pretty happy with that. Now, let's talk pricing for a minute. Sorry about the wobbling. I've got my laptop on my lap, which is what they're supposed to be for. So, pricing. The Recabinet, which I was using, is $15. So it's not very much at all, really, considering it's got that dynamic thing. And yes, there are free ones, like this Nadir by Ignite Amps, but that cuts the impulse response pretty short. I was playing with that, and the other thing is it doesn't have that dynamics enhancing type thing. So it loads an impulse response, and that's your lot. That's all you get. And if that's what you're after, hey, fine. But the Recabinet with that dynamic emulation and the inbuilt EQ with the low and high pass can save you a lot of time in a mix, and that could be exactly what you need. Now the Thermionik amps, these are really interesting because there's a massive list like I showed you here. Just make sure you can see that. Yeah, there. So they are all, I think it's $12 each, $12.99 each. Let's look in the shop. So it's $50 for a bundle. That is to say, I think it's 5 amps in a bundle, so that makes it $10 each. Or they're $12 each. Where are they? I found them. Come on. I just want to find where each cabinet is because I found these before. Store. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so they're just lower down. But yeah, each one is $12.99, so that's £10 less. And yeah, $12.99 for one of these amps is absolutely a bargain in my opinion. They sound absolutely fantastic, and I'll be buying a couple of them, maybe even a few of them. If you want to buy every single one, it's just over $200, which sounds like a lot, but that's a lot of amps and a lot of work's gone into that. But for me, I'm going to be buying just the ones I like, which seems though there's a 14-day trial. Hey, why not? So I'm probably going to spend $45 and the cabinet. So for $60, I'm going to get an absolutely insane set of amp sounds that are exactly what I'm looking for. If you prefer the sounds of the other amps, you go and buy the other amps. But this guy, Kazrog, these amps, Thermionik, they are absolutely incredible. So go and buy them. I'll put a link down in the description for their website and the store. So go and get them and have fun making some epic music. I've been Adam Steele for the Hot Pulse Studios. Thanks for watching.